This study was conducted in order to examine the influence of volcanic activity on vegetation succession based on altitude on two different lava flows at Zafferena, Mount Etna, Sicily. Factors such as soil cover, aspect, orientation, species abundance, and species percentage were investigated. The aim was to investigate how the age of two different lava flows have influenced species succession based on altitude at Zafferena, Mount Etna, Sicily. The objectives: to measure species abundance and diversity of vegetation using a 2 by 2 meter quadrat at specific altitudes at both chosen study sites. To analyze the orientation of species topography and identify peaks and troughs within the landscape to determine whether there are changes in vegetation succession. To analyze soil cover and depth to determine the succession of species growth.
Ecological succession is a time-dependent process with changing vegetation characteristics such as density, cover, and species richness, diversity, and composition. It results from a modification of stress and disturbances regime. It changes ecosystems which are unstable to stable concerning cover, biomass, and/or diversity information content. Plant succession is characterized into primary and secondary succession. Primary succession, which occurs following complete destruction of biosystems, where the ground surface is covered by rocks and/or inorganic soil substrates, is considerably different from secondary succession, which may be initiated by burns or abandoned fields. The most important process of primary succession is the accumulation of nutrients, including nitrogen, in the soil. Primary succession is considered to be principally inundated by blue-green algae, mosses, and lichens, etc., while secondary succession begins more or less from mature soils containing a sizable bank of seeds and vegetation. Soils take time to develop after a volcanic eruption, and often the first form of life is lichen because it can live without soil. Lichen helps break down the rocks, releasing minerals, while the wind may begin to bring in dust, sand, and other nutrients, forming the beginning of soil. The succession of vegetation can also determine the relative age of the lava flow, which can be distinguished by the lava surface morphology, soil conditions, climate and microclimate, as well as the biological characteristics of participating species. Notably, species with deeper roots will have taken more time to colonize the area and require deep soil. Climate is determined by altitude and precipitation and is the main factor for determining the growth of vegetation on Mount Etna. These create clear boundaries that are referred to as vegetation belts. The first belt, between 500 and 1,000 metres, is known as the Meso-Mediterranean belt. Here, conditions are ideal for growth for flora species due to the periodic rainfalls and the average minimum temperatures of 4 degrees Celsius and the maximum of 40 degrees Celsius. Between 1,000 and 1,700 metres is the lower supra-Mediterranean belt. Temperatures here tend to be cooler but still remain above 0 degrees Celsius all year round. Next is the higher upper Mediterranean belt between 1,700 and 2,000 metres. Here rainfall is more frequent and lower temperatures regularly falling below 0 degrees Celsius in winter. Between 2,000 and 2,500 metres is referred to as the high mountain belt. Heavy snowfall is common here, where winters tend to be below minus 10 degrees Celsius, and the location is covered in snow for 5 consecutive months of the year. Finally, at 2,500 metres plus, the classification of volcanic desert. Due to the exposure and high winds, the vegetation is unable to grow and the land remains barren. There is a lack of research investigating vegetation succession and lava flows on Mount Etna. A study has investigated the Mediterranean evergreen vegetation in Sicily, researching progressive and regressive succession. Marchese et al., 1988. Another study has investigated tree ring growth and monitoring volcanic activity. They discovered that tree ring growth histories can be analysed to provide valuable information on pre-eruptive volcanic processes to reconstruct the past volcanic events. Celia et al., 2017. Other studies and the Hawaiian Islands, carried out by Forbes in 1912, McCarthy in 1917, Robbins and Lamb in 1939, and Egler in 1971.
The study area chosen for this project is at Zafferena, Mount Etna, Sicily. There has been extensive research on monitoring vegetation development in Sicily. However, there is a lack of research available on vegetation succession at this site. This project will concentrate on the Meso-Mediterranean vegetation belt, which is between 500 to 1,000 meters. Site A, the lava flow occurred in 1991 to 1993, and at Site B, the lava flow occurred in 1852 to 1853. The data collection sites were located between 881 meters and 746 meters above sea level on basalt lava flows on the eastern slopes of Mount Etna. The study sites were located approximately 200 meters away from each other. According to Luiso et al., the climate is Mediterranean, characterized by mild winters and hot, relatively dry summers. The annual precipitation levels in the area varies from 400 millimeters a year to 1,300 millimeters a year. The mean annual temperature ranges are between 11 degrees and 19.4 degrees. Highest temperatures are recorded along the coast, 18.5 to 19.5 degrees, while the lowest temperatures, 10.5 to 13.5, are typically of the highest elevations. Site A. This site was chosen as there is a lack of literature concerning vegetation succession in this area, and it is an easily accessible site. Zafferena Etnea lava flow was the most prolonged and significant eruption to occur at the volcano in the last 300 years. This episode lasted 473 days and generated 235 times 10 to the power of 6 meters cubed of lava, forming a flow field, some 8.5 kilometers long from the source fissure, which extended within 800 meters of the town of Zafferena. Site B. This site was chosen as it was only 200 meters away from Site A, allowing Site B to be more representative to Site A. This site is significantly older than Site A, potentially demonstrating further succession of the vegetation species. This lava flow was caused by an eruption on the eastern flank of Mount Etna on the 20th of August 1852 to the 27th of May 1853. It built two large cinder cones. Heavy ash falls and lava flows were reported in very close proximity to Zafferena, reaching the edges of the town and causing significant damage. The lava volume was 120 times 106 meters cubed, and the tephra volume was equal to 12 times 10 to the power of 6 meters cubed. Methodology. Before site investigations can be carried out, a pilot study will be conducted at both sites to evaluate feasibility, time, and improve upon the project design. This project will be using altitudinal transects at 3 sites on each lava flow. The sites will be observed beforehand to find the highest and the lowest altitude of each lava flow that is accessible to use. At all sites, an altitude will be established every 100 meters on both lava flows using a GPS. At each interval, a 2x2 meter quadrat will be placed down along the transect, 50 meters away from any public footpaths to reduce the human activity on the environment. 150 centimeters will be observed either side of the transect to remove bias. At each individual site, sampling points plus and minus 5 degrees in altitude, a quadrat will be placed down to increase the reliability of the results found in this area and to investigate the small-scale variations in altitude. A picture of each quadrat will be taken just in case to be able to identify the unknown species. The abundance of species will be accounted for in each quadrat, and the percentage cover will be analysed as it is easier for mosses and lichens. The aspects will also be analysed, where troughs and peaks of the lava flow will demonstrate the orientation north, east, south or west the vegetation is facing. This will be demonstrated using rose diagrams for each lava flow and will establish any patterns. Soil cover, such as bare lava or clinker, will be observed by using percentage cover. A metal rod will be placed in the ground to establish soil depth and then measured using a tape measure.
Following site work, All findings were initially recorded as field notes, so were not in the most effective format to compare the data effectively. This table shows the results collected at each of the sites we observed. The three objectives of this project was to look at whether age, altitude, and soil depth affect the percentage cover of floral species of the two lava flows studied. Initial data collection contained additional data which was not required for the investigation into these three criteria. The first objective was to identify whether the age of the two lava flows impacted the percentage cover of floral species. The data at each site was compiled together and then transformed into a format where it was possible to form a comparison between floral species and aspect as shown in the table. Aspect was used because it was one of the criteria we aimed to investigate. This was to see whether the orientation of plant species in regard to the sun would affect plant growth. As the data was included as a percentage cover, all data needed to be divided by the number of quadrats with the same aspect in order to not over-represent each floral type. As a result, two rows diagrams were created. The data demonstrated the older lava flow had a higher range of diverse species, with focus on plants, mosses, bushes, and lichens. The most dominant species found was moss number 2, with a total coverage of 19.67%. The old lava flow contained 20 different identified floral species. By comparison, the new lava flow only contained 12 different floral species, the most dominant species being lichen number 2, which covered 111.67%. The reason for this significantly high percentage of over 100% is due to the quadrat we used being only two-dimensional, but the surface we observed being three-dimensional, meaning the amount of lichen covering the vertical surface of the lava flow had also been included as well. From the results, it is clear that the newer lava flow has more lichens and mosses-based species, as well as the rock breaker bush, which indicates that this lava is at a pioneer stage. Due to the wider variety of plant-based floral species and the establishment of trees like the holm oak indicates that the older lava flow is approaching or at climactic climax. The second objective involved looking at whether altitude affected the diversity of flora. This was done as sites at both lava flows were measured at similar altitudes. This was undertaken at low, medium, and high altitude to see if there was any change across the Meso-Mediterranean belt. As with the first objective of the investigation, each flora type was compared to the aspect and the flora type combined, but this time based on the altitude of the sample site. At the lower altitude, lichen 2 was the most dominant flora species at 47.5% coverage and had a range of 16 different floral species. Included in this was the holm oak. The middle altitude had the highest percentage coverage again with lichen 2, but this time with 72.67%, with a total species number of 12 different floral types. Finally, the higher altitude had the highest percentage coverage with moss 1 at 20%, with 17 different floral species identified. The high altitude also had the highest number of different plant species, with 10 different plant-based species recorded at this altitude. Due to the similarity with the results, there is not enough evidence to suggest that altitude has a significant effect on the species diversity found. This is supported by the idea that flora types are mainly dependent on climate. This is determined by the combination of altitude and precipitation. As all sites used in this investigation are within the Meso-Mediterranean belt, they all experience the same climatic conditions. From the results produced by the data collected, it is clear that altitude does not act as a key influence on species diversity, but the age of the lava flow does provide more of a correlation indicating that age of the lava flow will have an impact on the vegetation found. The third and final objective was to look at the relationship between soil depth and the plant species. The data at the sites that had the same depths were combined together. The recorded depths have been plotted against the percentage coverage to create this line chart. In low depths, 0 to 4 cm, lichens and moss tend to be the main floral species present due to the shallow soils preventing plant growth. Between 5 and 9 cm, lichens are still the most dominant floral species, but there is a higher amount of other floral species, including the introduction of some plant life. Depths of 9 to 11 cm, plant 1 and tree 1 have the highest percentage cover. This is due to the deeper and more developed soil that is being able to be established, allowing the growth of plant life with deeper roots.
As discussed within the results, the research carried out within this project showed that there was very little correlation within the data for the influence of altitude and the succession of vegetation within the Meso-Mediterranean belt. It did show that there was a correlation between the age of the lava flow and the progression of vegetation succession. The aim we set out to achieve within this project has been met with mixed results. 2 of the 3 objectives set have been met. The objective relating to the influence of altitude on vegetation has not been met. This is due to the limitations we have faced in relation to the subsequent lava flows from 1852 to 1853. In order to establish if there is an influence of vegetation from altitude, it would have been beneficial to have been able to collect data from much higher up in the lava flows. However, this was not possible to undertake and be able to undertake a comparison of the two lava flows at the same time. This is due to the subsequent lava flows after the 1852 to 1853 event encroaching on the higher altitude areas of the 1852 lava flow towards the Val de Bove area. Other studies, such as the 2010 Marquise Morale study into the floristic change during the early primary succession on lava within Mount Etna, were unable to reach higher altitudes in order to identify if there are any influence on primary succession. The 1852 to 1853 lava flow is fairly well vegetated. However, volcanic soil takes a very long time to develop, hence why the 1991 to 1993 lava flow has far less visible soils and vegetation. The development of soils on lava flow takes longer to develop due to the complete absence of any existing soils or vegetation which can produce soil. Most of the recently formed surfaces on Mount Etna have been produced from eruptions from the Montebello area of the summit. This contains the northeast and southeast craters. Since the lava flows have produced, pioneer species such as lichen and mosses have been able to grow on the bare lava. After years of progressive decay from these mosses and lichens, a soil begins to form which can sustain other plant species. The soil which is created is a shallow, fertile soil dubbed a microsoil. To develop into a deeper soil, it will take a much longer period of time, which requires other forms of vegetation to grow within the microsoil, in order to increase the decayed organic matter which is found within more established soils. Some areas within the lava flows will remain as a bare inhospitable surface until the vegetated areas produce enough soil to be transferred to these areas by either the depth of soil increasing to include them or being carried there by the wind. The results of the investigation show that there is a correlation between the soil depth recorded and the type of vegetation which was identified within the area. This can be seen within the graph shown. Lichens, a flora species formed through a mutualistic relationship between algae and fungus, are first found in areas where there are microorganisms present. Microorganisms such as cyanobacteria are a primary source of food for the lichen. These bacteria are found on lava flows once they have cooled. Without the presence of these lichen, will not be able to colonise on the lava flows. Lichens are regarded as a pioneer species. Within the results we collected, the most abundant lichen identified was
Stereocolumn Vesuvium.
Over time, sand and other fine particles such as ash congregate in small cracks within the lava flows, encouraging the growth of mosses alongside the lichen communities present. The Byrum argenteum moss was the most common form of moss and was identified across the sample locations on both of the sites. On the older lava flow, it could be found on some of the outcropping rock areas. The Polytrichum proliferum moss was one of the key flora species identified across both of the lava flows studied. Although moss is a pioneer species, it was found in much greater quantities on the 1852 to 1853 lava flow. This can be accounted to the greater amount of fine particles present due to the erosion and breakdown of the surface lava into soil over time. Bushes and other plant species cannot usually form until a more mature nutrient-rich soil has been established within the site. Bushes, known as rockbreaker or Etna broom by local residents, can grow in the harsh environment on the flanks of Etna without a well-developed soil. If these bushes are identified within the site and are one of the only plant species present, then the lava flow is still considered to be within the pioneer stage of vegetation succession. Climax species have also been identified within some of the sample sites. Plants such as the pink rock rose were identified on the 1852 to 1853 lava flow. Within other sample sites on the same lava flow, the native holm tree has also been identified. This tree is mainly found on the western flanks of Etna, but is also a common species of oak around Zafferena. These climax flora species need a deep depth and developed soil in order to grow, which is why they will not be found on the 1991 to 1993 lava flow. Though the 1852 to 1853 lava flow is in the early stages of succession, being a lava flow still causes implications to the native plant species. Plants like black mustard, white-haired mustard, and leaf beet cannot grow on the igneous soil. Previously, these plant species would have been native to the location of the lava flows, as they are found within the Meso-Mediterranean belt and on native sedimentary soils. Usually below 1,500 metres in altitude, the natural cover would have been replaced with vineyards and other crops.
During our fieldwork, there were a few limitations. Upon arriving at our site, we realised that the location originally proposed to be our Site B was not easily accessible. During our pilot run, we soon identified a more practical and accessible site located next to our original Site A. Further research identified this lava flow to be older and with easy accessibility. Both sites are located near a path, meaning the increased level of human interaction to the site, such as trampling, disturbing, and walking, could have disrupted the environment and potentially affect the vegetation result. To reduce this, we made sure all sites we investigated were at least 50 metres away from anything that could resemble a footpath. This limited the sites we could investigate, as altitude and this factor did not always align. Due to no member in our group being vegetation experts or having a vast and in-depth knowledge of floral species, identification of species proved challenging. To reduce this, the main focus was to identify the names of all key species of the vegetation observed within the sample site. For all other floral types, detailed descriptions and pictures were taken to be identified in the future if required. This is why, in the result, the vegetation are still named as the floral type and assigned a number. Further research into soil condition could have been undertaken to explore factors such as pH, dry density, organic matter content, nitrogen, ammonia, and phosphorus concentrations by taking and analyzing soil samples at each site. Finally, due to time constraint and accessibility, the investigation of further sites and different vegetation belts would have significantly improved the findings and demonstrate the influence of altitude on the succession of vegetation. Previously mentioned in the discussion, Site B had newer lava flows spread across the top of the flow, limiting our altitude range. This meant that the site work was only focused on the Meso-Mediterranean vegetation belt on the eastern flank of Etna. Looking at additional belts and flanks of Etna would allow for the further investigation on the effects of floral coverage with emphasis on different spatial and climate conditions. This process could also be repeated on different age lava flows to see if a common age in which the vegetation of the lava flow changes from a pioneer to climatic climax species.
This project investigated 3 objectives concerning age, altitude and soil cover of 2 lava flows and how this affected the distribution of flora species. The 1991 to 1993 lava flow demonstrated a large abundance of pioneer species with lichens, mosses and some bushes. The 1852 to 1853 lava flow was significantly older, demonstrated a higher abundance of plants and species of trees, meaning the climax community had been reached. There was a clear correlation between soil depth and abundance of flora types. Where there was an absence of soil, there was dominated by lichens and mosses, as the lack of soil was insufficient for growth of deeper-rooted plants. Deeper soils demonstrated this as there was an increase in species abundance and diversity as the soil depth increased. Finally, altitude did not play a major role due to the limitations of the site access, which meant only the Meso-Mediterranean vegetation belt was investigated, and therefore areas with a different climate were not investigated.